first, of course, as an economist, we cannot avoid talking about GDP. And GDP is currently evolving in the vicinity of 3% for the year as a whole, and did the same last year, this year, and in all likelihood also next year. And 3% is also the long-term average GDP growth. So it's sort of lukewarm, you know, not great, not bad, and in actual fact, quite a good thing for the global economy. The global economy works best when it's stable. It tends to be an advantage over volatile results. So that's the general backdrop. But then, if we look at Q4 versus Q4 evolutions, we see that it is a little bit more complicated than just average 3%, because we are going into a deceleration this year. You can see the red bar in 2025 is obviously a lot lower than that one in 24. So the economy is now decelerating, and then we are looking forward to it re-accelerating in the second half of 2026. So that's the backdrop, and obviously a very important thing for us all to keep in mind, because it tends to be the major driver of traffic growth in our industry. Now, the absolutely amazing thing that happened this year was the front loading. So we went into 2025, certainly I was terrified that the tariffs were going to ruin economic growth for almost everybody, and we anticipated a much worse outcome than what we actually got. So what happened was that people were anticipating these tariffs and then buying as much as they possibly could ahead of those tariffs entering into force. And one amazing thing is the agility of the Chinese exporters and the agility of the importers in all these other countries, who could redirect the trade sort of at the drop of a hat. So you see that the red bar is the trade that was lost between China and the US, and then the green bar is all the new trade that happened in this environment. And we can see that we obviously increased trade in 25 for Chinese exporters, which was completely unexpected given the protectionist move that we had in this year. So more than offsetting the lost trade, and obviously underpinning much better GDP results in 25 than we had anticipated. And obviously that would not have happened but for air cargo. Yeah, so this is another situation where air cargo totally came to the world's rescue, just as they did during the COVID period. And you can see here how exceptional that is. Yeah, so the dotted circles or dashed circle, you can see that CTK growth is still positive in spite of the red line, which is trade growth, tending to zero, and the yellow line is GDP growth. And so if you contrast this dashed circle with all the previous times when trade growth was almost zero, you see that that tended to also drag the CTKs down. So this is a very unique phenomenon that happened in 2025, and it wouldn't have happened without air cargo, because the ships would have been too slow to get the goods into the right harbor in time ahead of these protectionist measures biting. So that's absolutely phenomenal, and we're so grateful for air cargo. And in spite of that being such an exceptionally fabulous phenomenon, we might not be able to count on it bringing the same benefits to the global economy forever. And here we see the relative prices in blue, what it costs to use air cargo, in red sea cargo yields, and the yellow line is the ratio between the two. And when this yellow line increases, air cargo becomes relatively less competitive. Yeah, so we are becoming relatively less competitive compared to, you see, the exceptional period between 21, 22, where air cargo rescued us during the COVID period. So we're expecting somewhat less cargo growth going forward, but still, insist on this remarkable and unexpected contribution that our industry did to GDP this year. Now, the capacity constraints we have mentioned, but I just wanted to add that the cargo fleet is also facing these capacity constraints. And here you can see the different types of ways that you can influence your cargo fleet. And you see how low the deliveries are, how big the conversions are, and then, you know, actually how small the retirements have been because people are flying older planes. And therefore the net result in green is the fleet change. So we see how cargo is also, of course, struggling with the rest of the industry to increase its fleet. And what all of this in sum amounts to, of course, are record high passenger load factors. So the planes are flying exceptionally full. And this is a world record that we are predicting for 2026 at 83.8%. So it's, you know, very, very near full capacity. And the mind sort of boggles, like, is it possible to go to 100? You know, probably not. So, but nevertheless, this is very positive for underpinning financial performance and profitability in the industry, which we are going to talk about now. So these are the profits that we expect or have experienced and do expect. So in 2026, we're looking at $41 billion for the whole industry for the whole year. And that's a 3.9% net margin, which is, as Willie said, obviously just below 4%. And for the industry, it's actually not that bad because we've never had a profit margin in excess of 5%. Yeah, so we're at the top of the range of our past profit margins, but, you know, it obviously still remains an excruciatingly low profit margin. In a low profit margin sector, we are still among those with the lowest profit margins. And 41 billion, I mean, just think about 41 billion, you know? You can take any large oil company and they can, on their own, single company, realize this type of profit in a single quarter. And this is our annual profit for the whole industry. When we divide it per region, it looks like this. So in the bars, you have the profits in billions, and in the little squiggles, you have the net profit margin. And one interesting thing is happening in 2026, we think, which is that Europe will, in billions, surpass the US. So the US is now, we think, the second largest money-making machine as it pertains to our industry. So Europe surpasses the US, North America, I should say, in terms of billions of dollars of profits. And the champion in terms of net profit margins are the Middle Easterns, as you can clearly see how much higher margin they create than everybody else. And then, as per usual, and unfortunately and deeply sadly, it is still extremely difficult for airlines in Africa to make any kind of profits, and they also, therefore, of course, suffer the slimmest margins because of policy fragmentation and you know, they have on average 20% higher fuel costs than everybody else, and all kinds of difficulties that are hard for the airline themselves to fix. They are just sort of having to suffer that environment. Now, when we look at where the money comes from, most of the money comes from passenger revenue, and the blue bottom line is the revenue that comes from cargo activities, and the yellow one is ancillary and other revenue. And we can see that the ancillary revenues are expanding and almost catching up with cargo revenue. So these two look like they're going to be of equal size, but of course vastly outstripped by the revenue that comes from passenger traffic. On the cost side, it looks like this. So we have two big components of costs, which are, of course, fuel and labor. And fuel is now just short of 26%, and labor is now 28%. So that's a positive evolution, that we have benefited from a lower fuel price, and we have benefited from a weaker dollar, and this has contributed to push fuel into the second largest category, cost category for airlines behind labor. And per passenger, we get this kind of profit distribution. So for the industry as a whole, it will generate $7.9 per passenger. And then you can see the split between the regions. So clearly the Middle East are generating the highest per passenger profits by some distance, yeah? Given that Europe is in second place with sort of $18 less. And then of course Africa again stuck at a bottom with barely $1 per passenger profit. And the apples are a reference to Willie's quote that you can buy a cover for your Apple phone and at whatever price, but the profit that cover of your Apple phone generates for Apple is about even higher, but vaguely in this size, right, of $8. So a cover of Apple phone is sort of the equivalent benefit that our activity generates. Yeah, I hope you feel as outraged as I am at that comparison, and of course I love that Willie and Tony maybe found that comparison. I think that's very good, and I hope I also satisfy all of you with no longer talking about coffee, and we're trying to find every year a new basis of comparison for our per passenger profits. So Apple it is. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Great clear. I suspect that's generated some questions amongst the journalists joining us here today. We're very happy to take your questions. A reminder, the embargo is still on. It's only 9:30. We've got an hour before that comes off, which means we also have an hour for questions. Please raise your hand, and when you start your question, just identify yourself and your congregation, and we'll take it from there. So we'll start over here.
Hi, Joanna Kuczynska from Reuters. Given the ongoing supply chain challenges, I wanted to ask a question specifically about Airbus and their decision to limit their delivery targets for the year. What sort of impact does that have, and how would you compare what happened there to the Boeing crisis? And then if you have any broader comments on accountability when it comes to supply chain issues and delivery targets. Great.
Yeah, so obviously Airbus will fall short of their original forecast for deliveries, or would appear with 1 month to go, but I think based on deliveries at the end of November, it's unlikely that they'll meet the target that they had set. Disappointing, no great surprise. I think again, there is often a disconnect between what the airframe OEMs can do and what the engine OEMs can do, and we're likely to see that continue for some time. So it just adds to the problem, continues to frustrate people. I think we are seeing a shift where it's generally recognized that Boeing's performance has significantly improved. People have a lot more confidence in Boeing delivering the commitments that they have made, and we're seeing people having less confidence in Airbus. These things have happened before. But overall, it's disappointing for the industry because we will have fewer new aircraft being delivered than was expected, which will mean that airlines that were due to take delivery of those new aircraft will continue to operate aircraft that they have planned to retire, or will have to continue to lease aircraft that they have planned to return to the lessor. So it's just adding to the cost that the industry is bearing. And one of the other issues that probably isn't fully captured in the analysis that we did, but maybe needs to be done in a second stage analysis, is we're seeing evidence now of airlines having to retain leased aircraft for longer than they had expected because they're not able to fulfill the redelivery conditions associated with the lease because they can't get the maintenance, particularly the engine maintenance, completed in time to be able to hand back the aircraft. So these problems continue to add to the financial challenge that the industry has. I don't want to, pick on Airbus and Boeing too much because they've been in the focus of our anger for some time. That's why I've deliberately highlighted the engine OEMs and some of the other OEMs, and we'll continue to do this. But when you put the whole supply chain and all of the OEMs together, it's a very disappointing performance. But we are pleased that Boeing has significantly raised its game. And as I said, the general view that's being expressed now is that Boeing are delivering on the commitments that they've made. When they tell an airline they'll get an aircraft in March, they're getting the aircraft in March. There's less confidence in Airbus than there has been, and I think Airbus need to reflect on the problems that Boeing encountered and to make sure that they get their act together and start delivering good quality aircraft at the time they promised the aircraft to the airlines.
Great, thank you. Take a question at the back. Just press on the microphone, please.
Yeah, good morning. Tanguy Kiriner with Agence France Presse based in Paris. I wanted to ask you really, and maybe Mary as well, about North America, where demand is projected to be a bit flat in 2026. And I was wondering if the current administration's policies were playing a big role in that, especially when it comes, with enforcing immigration and the recent signals such as severely hiking national parks fees for foreigners. Is it a big concern to you, the months forward? Thank you.
So I think the US is, what you got to remember about the US, it's a very big domestic market. About 2/3 of the capacity is in the domestic market, 1/3 in international. So it's more a reflection of what's happening in the domestic market. And what we're seeing there is obviously continuing reduction in capacity at some of the major airports, particularly around New York, because of ATC issues. And they will continue into 2026. So airlines have, if you like, tempered their ambition in terms of expansion. I think there's clearly some US economic issues that maybe Mari would like to comment on. When I look at international travel, particularly North Atlantic, it continues to be okay. So I was just looking at the figures this morning. To the end of October, the Europe to North America, so the transatlantic is up 2.6% versus last year. So that's positive development. I think the growth is less than maybe people had anticipated at the beginning of the year. The flow of traffic is more US into Europe than Europe into US. So again, I think the stories that we're hearing about border issues in the US and these additional fees will have less of an impact on the overall evolution of the market. So I would expect transatlantic traffic to continue to grow in 2026. But I think we do have to recognize that there are limitations on airport capacity, principally as a result of ATC. And then I think there's, the US domestic economy has been impacted by higher prices. I think it's recognized by everybody that prices, cost of living issues still dominate the consumer issues in the US. But maybe Mari, you'd like to comment?
Yeah, sure. So definitely we do see that prices are sticky. Service prices are, very reluctant to come down, and we don't know exactly the transmission delays, for the tariff measures and so on. So I think even Jerome Powell would say that he's likely to be disappointed in terms of the lack of speed with which inflation is going to come down. But the central bank has said at the same time that they are more worried about the labor market. So that is, of course, where we will have to keep our eyes focused on seeing, what could possibly be the impact on the labor market, which has been so absolutely stellar in spite of all the difficulties in the global economic context. So, you know, the worst thing that could happen, of course, is that the labor market slows, that monetary and fiscal policy fails to sort of save the labor market, unemployment shoots up, and inflation remains high. Yeah, so I think, you know, that concept of some sort of mild form of stagflation is entirely plausible. Yeah, now, please don't be too alarmed when I say that, yeah, because it's all relative, and we still are not projecting an outright recession in the US, and think that the central bank will, you know, have a reasonable impact on these parameters. But that's sort of, nevertheless, the conceptual context that I believe that we can anticipate in the US.
Okay, we'll come to the front of the room to take a question here, and then we'll move towards the other
Good
side.
morning, Ricardo Delgado from Latin America, you see Latin America traffic growth, but however, mentioning the critical situation as the currency fluctuation. But what happened with the regulations and taxes? We have new taxes in Brazil, 8 projects about new consumer regulation in Chile. We have a high taxes for the connecting price in Lima. What is your opinion for the next year?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted the challenge in Latin America. So we have, I think, great opportunity there. It is potentially, it should be one of the fastest growing markets in the world. Connectivity is absolutely critical, but we are seeing the growth in Latin America and the low levels of profitability in the airline industry, which continue to be frustrated by regulations, which are clearly damaging the industry and constraining the availability of growth. I think the industry is still viewed as a very profitable industry, when in fact it's not. I think often governments get misled by looking at the top line revenue rather than the bottom line profit, and believe that this is an industry that can bear additional regulation and additional costs. We are seeing some indications that I would describe as being positive, particularly in Brazil, but there's a lot more that needs to happen there. We're pleased to bring the AGM to Brazil next year at Rio, because I think it'll give us an opportunity to really showcase the Latin American market and what we believe it could be if some of these regulatory and taxation issues were addressed. So I think it's very frustrating. Again, you've got very well-run airlines who have been, you know, forced into restructuring. A lot of it because of currency volatility completely outside of their control. A lot of it frustrated by regulation and taxes, which again completely outside of their control. So I think these airlines are very well-run, very capable management teams. You know, in some cases, I would describe them as you know, really top-class airline leadership there. But the operating environment in Latin America is particularly challenging. It's probably slightly better than Africa, but you know, many of the issues we find in Africa, we find in Latin America as well. And it's disappointing because we do believe that there's enormous opportunity for growth in the market, which would help to facilitate greater economic growth as well. And that's the message that we will be delivering to governments, particularly at the AGM next year, when I think, as I said, we will have an opportunity to really showcase the Latin American market versus the rest of the world and what could be possible there.
Yeah, well, so I feel like stressing the fact that these specific taxes, that airline ticket tax, that, you know, when governments impose ticket taxes, they're obviously paid for by the passenger, and we call them specific taxes. And they are, you know, in economics, the least favored form of taxes. If we were to consult the government as to how do you best raise taxes in your country, this is what, you know, a broad consensus of economists have arrived at, saying that this is the least effective. So, because they tend to be very distortionary for the industry that they target, and then they raise very little money for the government. And this is why most governments prefer broad-based, equal sales taxes, for instance, VAT, on same rate on everybody, so to speak, with few exceptions. That is, the go-to tax option for governments. We obviously think that governments need to raise taxes, yeah? Without taxes, there are no government services. We just want them to raise taxes in a more efficient way. And again, I'm insisting on this fact that economists and I believe governments as well, some of them at least have now understood that specific ticket taxes come with the highest distortions and generate the least money.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the other side of the room. Sure.
Hope this works. Yes. Hello again. I'm Hoffman from Air Transport World. Two topics. Really, you mentioned at the very beginning the social media channels bringing videos from airlines during aircraft during evacuation. What do you think airlines can do or should do immediately to reduce this coverage? And maybe you have a number for us. How many aircrafts actually operating worldwide at the moment?
So on the first one, I think what you have seen is an increase in announcements being made by crew when preparing for takeoff and landing, reiterating the fact that in the event of an emergency, people should leave their hand baggage behind. More and more airlines are making that announcement. More and more people, I'm pleased to say, seem to be aware that that announcement is being made, but the message needs to get across in a much stronger way. I stress the fact that these are incredibly rare incidents, but if you are unfortunate enough to be involved in an event where the aircraft has to be evacuated, all I can say to you is get off that aircraft as quickly as possible. And that should be the message for everybody. Crew are trained to get the people out of the aircraft. The manufacturers have proven that the aircraft can be evacuated safely within 90 seconds. But what we're seeing of late is, people delaying the evacuation because they're stopping in the aisles to try and recover their hand baggage, and it's an absolutely crazy thing to do. In terms of the number of aircraft operating, the number I have in my head is about 27,000. Currently, give or take a couple of hundred, around 27,000 aircraft.
Okay, we'll take the question here and then we'll go on to the other side.
Hi, Shakir, Aviation Turkey magazine. European countries increase their defense budgets nowadays and direct their resources into and budgets into this. So, and you mentioned that airport infrastructure is becoming encouraging, but in terms of Europe, I'm curious about what do you think about how it will affect the industry in terms of supply chain and production plus infrastructures.
It's a point that we have recognised that with the increased focus on military spend, it will put additional pressure on the supply chain, both for the aircraft specific parts, which we have factored into our analysis going forward. Less so on the airport development side, but without question, it is going to put additional stress on the overall supply chain, and it's clear that there will be priority given, I think, in the short term certainly, to the requirement to significantly increase the production on the defence side over the civil side. So that is recognised as an additional factor in the supply chain. But we have, in our analysis of the aircraft supply issues, we have factored that in at this point.
Thank you. Any question here?
Yeah, just on the supply, sorry, Ian Taylor from Travel Weekly in London. Hi, really. Just on the supply chain issue, I understand the frustration, but I'm struggling to see how the measures outlined this morning are going to make a significant difference, since the predictive maintenance and so on came in at the same time as the supply chain issues have just got worse and worse.
Yeah, well, I think on the maintenance side, as Stuart said, one issue that can be addressed is having more third-party maintenance suppliers. the problem often there is the licensing required to undertake these maintenance activities and issues in terms of the supply of parts. So, you know, where parts that are supplied by the OEM directly tend to be much more expensive than parts that are supplied by alternative manufacturers, or in some cases the same manufacturer, but providing the part directly to the airline rather than to the OEM and then to the airline. So I think a review of how the aftermarket operates, particularly in the case of engines, is something that could make a big difference, because as the report pointed out, the amount of time taken to get an engine through the shop is significantly longer than it was, and in many cases this is because the maintenance provider is waiting for parts to be delivered. And in some cases these are very small, I wouldn't say inexpensive, because anything that goes into an engine is relatively expensive, but you know, in the overall context of things can be parts that would appear to be less expensive are delaying the delivery of the aircraft from the shop. I don't know.
Yes, as you mentioned, Willie, the issue is the supply of parts. In particular, if we can get a wider pool of usable parts, so as you mentioned, alternative parts, we do see an increase in the use of those parts, and as Willie mentioned, sometimes these parts are produced by the same supplier as the original OEM parts. That's a positive sign. Also for the usable serviceable materials as well, we see an increased use of those. So there's been a big dialogue going between IATA, the aircraft manufacturers, the OEMs, and our member airlines on what needs to be done. And there is a focus on maybe getting some agreement where these alternative parts can be used more widespread. As mentioned already, when you hand back an aircraft, you have to meet the requirements that were set in the leasing documents, etc. And in some cases, it requires bringing the aircraft back to the original condition, fitting original parts. So that there is some progress that could be made there, for example, and I'll see that as a positive step going forward.
Okay, we'll take a question in towards the back. Yes. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, sorry.
Sir, if you could just wait 1 minute, we'll take a question from the back and then we'll come to you.
Hi, Willie. This is Manoj Raman from DTI. So you mentioned about like India and China driving the growth. So in that context, two questions. One is about the airspace closure. So we have the airspace closure between India and Pakistan. Your comments, and also about the ongoing crisis as Indigo, which is mainly attributed to the flight duty norms.
Yeah, I think in relation to Indigo, I think your question is probably best directed at the management team. We're aware, obviously, of what's happening there as a result of the new flight time, duty time limitations that were introduced, impacting particularly on pilots, and that has led to the operational challenges that Indigo are facing at the moment. But I'm not fully up to speed with the events there, other than I know that Indigo appear to be making progress in getting back to full operations, and from the last report I saw, expect to be back at full production by next week. But I think you're probably best directing that at the Indigo team. In relation to airspace closures, yeah, it goes to what I said at the beginning. You know, we are seeing airspace being closed for political reasons, and clearly that's unacceptable to us. You know, it's wrong that governments are using their airspace as a political or economic measure, and we would much prefer to see airspace open to all carriers, particularly when it's clear that there's no safety or security risk associated with utilising the airspace. So I would hope that where we are seeing these political closures of airspace, that we will see that addressed, and that the airspace will reopen and be able to be used by all airlines. So it's disappointing for us to see an increase in the utilisation by governments of airspace as an economic and political weapon.
Okay, we'll come here.
I'll try again. So it's Oliver Gill from Sunday Times. Willie, you intimated there about legal action. being taken against, I think, the engine manufacturers. And could you expand a little bit on that? Is that a collective thing? Is that individual airlines? And just a second question, if I may, just around your point around the fact that airlines are going to have to reevaluate their commitments on SAF. That would mean that your former airline, IAG, would indeed have to, reevaluate. Are you expecting them to reevaluate their commitment next year?
So let me take the second question first. I don't know about specific airlines because some airlines have clearly made quite significant progress in accessing SAF. I would highlight IAG and Air France as being two, so they may not have to, but I leave it to them to determine that. But I think what has happened is what we've seen is that some airlines who've made these commitments have moved early to secure supply, which means that other airlines who've made similar commitments are now finding that there's no supply available to them because the limited supply has already been taken up by some of the airlines. Again, taking first mover advantage to secure their supply of SAF. So I leave it to the individual airlines to do that. But collectively, when I think of the industry, I've seen a figure that suggests that about 70% of airlines have made commitments around SAF by 2030. There's just no way that can be achieved. Absolutely no way. Then in relation to the first question, yeah, it's collective. So we as IATA would seek to, we've done this before, because obviously individual airlines are in a difficult position in that in many cases the commercial relationship they have with the OEM is something that they don't want to put at risk. And individual airlines are not in the position to share the nature of their commercial agreements. But what we have done in the past is utilising external lawyers in a clean room, evaluate whether there is potential collective action on behalf of the industry rather than individual action. So this what we're evaluating is collective action, where IATA would facilitate an evaluation of the situation to consider whether there is evidence of practice that may fall foul of competition laws. I'm not saying there is. All I'm saying is that I find it deeply worrying that suppliers at a time of crisis in the supply chain can be generating margins in the high 20s when the airline industry is incurring significant additional costs. So, given the evidence that's available to us at first glance, I think it does justify us taking a deeper look at this to see is there something going on that needs to be addressed at a legal level, but it's collective action.
Hello, Gianni Dragoni from here. I will, Il Fatto Quotidiano Italy. While the industry is setting new records about net profits, there are still some airlines struggling to reach an operating profit. We know one in Italy. So how would you comment on that, and how many airlines do you estimate are still in the red? And about the price of aircraft due to the restraints in the supply chain, do you see that the real price, not the list price, has increased over the past years?
So you're quite right to highlight the fact that while at a global level we're forecasting net margins of 3.9%, that's not a record, by the way. Record margin was 5% in 2017. As Murray pointed out, we've never done better than 5%. But there is a long list of airlines that are struggling to make profits. And that is one of the challenges that we face. So we don't comment on individual airline profitability. Our analysis has always been an overview of the whole industry. And it's not the IATA members, it's the total industry. So it includes airlines that are not members of IATA. So when we produce these figures, is an assessment of the overall airline industry profitability. But you're quite right to highlight the fact that there are many airlines who will be generating both operating and net margins in excess of the figure that we give there, and a lot of airlines who are struggling to make any margin at all, which continues to highlight the fact that at an industry level this is a brutally competitive industry and very difficult for airlines to succeed in the environment in which we're operating. The pricing, yeah, I think it's very clear that the actual prices that airlines are paying has increased. There's a lot more evidence in terms of lease rates, lease rentals, because that's more reported on by the industry, but we've seen a significant increase in aircraft lease rental payments, and that would typically give you an indication of what you're seeing with aircraft pricing as well. But the lease rentals are a factor both of pricing and of availability, and they have significantly increased, which is added to the part of the 11 million that Stuart outlined in the presentation that we made. So the prices are more expensive.
I'll take a question here.
Lennon Pepper from the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. I have a question related to the 2025 numbers, because on June you estimated a net profit of over 36 billion US dollars, and then now you are forecasting a 39.5. Can you give an explanation of this almost plus 10% improvement? Thank you.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that have happened. I think the cargo performance has been stronger than we had expected, as Murray said. We had anticipated cargo growth to be, I think the original forecast was 0.7%. We're now looking at over 3%. So cargo and the contribution that cargo makes to profitability has been greater than we had originally expected. And that has been a surprise because given everything that was being talked about in terms of the supply chain issues for not just the industry but overall, and then tariffs, we expected a more challenging environment for cargo. But what we've seen, and Murray mentioned it, is we've just seen the trade lanes have adapted. So the number one air cargo trade lane has always been from Asia into North America. That's declined by 1.1% year to date to the end of October. But the number two lane has been Europe to Asia, and that's improved by 10.6%. So we've just seen a change in the supply chain, the air cargo trade lanes, and that's led to a stronger performance from cargo, and then the US dollar has weakened from where we had originally expected, as Murray said. For non-US denominated airlines, a lot of the cost, about 50% of the cost base is in US dollars. So if you see a weakening US dollar, that normally is a positive. So there's been a few things that have changed. The general passenger environment has been okay. Our RPKs are slightly down on what we had expected, but that's mainly as a result of some disruptions that we witnessed in the middle of the year, which were driven in the main by the Middle East, events in the Middle East. But I would say two big factors, and maybe Murray, you want to add to it, two big factors since our June forecast is the US dollar and cargo.
Yeah, and I totally take the blame for having entered 2025 with the feeling that the sky was falling down and the global economy was going to come to an end. And we made actually a huge effort not to put all our pessimism into our first numbers, but clearly were sort of bizarrely saved by the implementation of these protectionist policies, which was piecemeal, delayed, on and off, And I'm not saying that any of that was good, but it was certainly better than the stratospheric protectionism that was predicted at the beginning of the year. So I just wanted to highlight that fact again, that factor as well. Thank you.
Question here?
Chris Jasper from the Daily Telegraph. Returning to SAF, you mentioned IAG there, but given that that 10% mandate applies to anyone uptaking fuel in the UK by 2030, do you think that ultimately the British government is going to have to revisit that target, just given the pressure from the wider industry and airlines more generally beyond IAG, perhaps saying that it's just untenable for them? And secondly, also, in terms of what you're saying about price gouging by the fuel suppliers, I presume that's just a reaction to supply and demand. I mean, what do you think the regulators could do about that? And also, by 2030, isn't it the case that the mandate actually falls on the fuel suppliers, not the airline, right?
Well, let me address this. So what we're seeing is that airlines that need to comply with mandates are unable to get supply. It's just physically impossible to get, so they can't meet their obligations under the mandates. So I think these mandates will have to be re-evaluated. The point you make about it falls on the supplier, no. The cost falls on the supplier. The supplier just passes those costs on. So if they don't supply the required amount of SAF, they get financially penalised. They just pass that on to the customer. That's exactly what's happening. And in fact, what they're doing now is they're anticipating that they're not going to meet the supply, and therefore they're already passing it on. So it's not a case of supply and demand. It's a case of these guys are in a position, because they're monopoly suppliers, to adjust the price to protect themselves, and in many cases not just protect themselves against the additional costs that they will incur, but actually to make even more money. And that's what we're seeing, so that these compliance fees that are being introduced are in anticipation of additional costs that they will face because they're not meeting the compliance under the obligations of the mandates. And that's just going to escalate and escalate and escalate. So I think Maury has, it'll be in one of the presentations we have, which will demonstrate the risk here. So I think where governments have introduced mandates in the genuine belief that these mandates would stimulate the supply, do need to look at what has actually happened. What is happening? Are we seeing supply being stimulated? The answer is no, we're not. In fact, we've seen a slowdown in the rate of the increase in the production of SAF. But what we have seen very clearly is prices significantly increasing. Now, the one thing I would say about the UK, which the UK has done better than the EU, is they've recognised that eSAF is quite important. They're not building up the requirement to produce eSAF, because I think there's a more fundamental debate that needs to take place around eSAF. Yes, we believe eSAF is important, but to produce sustainable eSAF, you have to have renewable energy. And we don't have sufficient renewable energy today. So what governments would need to do is first and foremost focus on generating additional renewable electricity, which would be absolutely critical to the production of eSAF, before they mandate the production of eSAF for the industry. So I think the EU in particular has got this one completely wrong. The UK, I think, didn't fall into that trap. But my clear assessment of the situation is these mandates are not having the desired effect. And quite honestly, if they're not having the desired effect, if it was any commercial entity looking at a policy that they introduced and they recognized that it wasn't having the desired effect, they would immediately change it. And we need governments to recognize that that needs to happen with regard to these policy decisions that they've taken. And I'm not saying they need to stand up and say we've got this wrong. Politicians never like to say this, But I think they do have an opportunity to stand up and say, actually, we've got a better idea. And that better idea should be to fundamentally review the mandates that they've put in place.
Take a question here.
Hello, I'm Claire Boulot from the French magazine Challenges. I have a very quick question. Could you just tell us when was the last time Europe was the more profitable market, please?
When was Europe the last leading in terms of industry profitability?
Ooh, good question. I'd need to check that. It's been the US for some years. Certainly coming out of COVID, it was the US. There would have been times prior to COVID. But let me have a look at that and come back to you.
Okay, take one on this side. Karen?
Thank you, Tony. Karen Walker, Air Transport World. Maybe Mari and Willie here, because you talked quite a bit about the 2030 targets looking more challenging, shall we say. Where do you think that fits with 2050? So do you feel less optimistic for those, or do we really need to see things by 2030 happening for 2050 to have a chance?
It's a great question. I think that the problem with, at an industry level, we did not set a 2030 target because our assessment of what was going to be possible by 2030 did not look externally ambitious. We believe that it was unlikely at an industry level that you could get greater than about 2.5% in 2030. So we decided that a short-term target in 2030 was largely irrelevant, that the focus had to be long-term on 2050, and that we had to get the policy decisions, the right policy decisions in place to ensure that we would get to 2050. So the ambition has to be by 2050. I believe 2050 is still possible, but getting more and more challenging. But it is still possible. And maybe what we're seeing at the moment should work as a wake-up call to, again, refocus on what needs to happen to enable this industry to get to net zero in 2050. So I've not encountered any change in commitment at an industry level around the 2050 target. But I have seen many airlines who, again, through no fault of their own, wished to demonstrate that they were ambitious in this area and set targets of SAF use in 2030, recognise that based on the production today that it's just not going to be possible for them to do that. And individual airlines who set it probably set those targets without paying too much attention to what was happening outside of their ability to source SAF. So there could well be airlines that will be able to achieve 10% in 2030, but the number of airlines who've made that commitment to use SAF in 2030 demonstrates to us that it's going to be possible. And we are seeing that now. We're seeing airlines who said, I'm now going to the market looking for SAF, and there's just no supply available. Any supply that was available has already been acquired by airlines who moved sooner. And that's not a criticism that they should have moved earlier. It's a criticism of the fact that the supply just doesn't exist. There is insufficient supply available to fulfill the commitments that all of these individual airlines have made. So I still think 2050 is possible. I haven't changed my view that it's going to be extremely challenging and it is going to be expensive, but I still believe it's possible.
Take a question here.
Yes, Tijn Kramer, Travel Media, the Netherlands. Could you comment on the safety issue of the recent disturbance by drones, especially in Western Europe, and also the lack of transparency, who or what is behind this?
Yeah, it's a concern, obviously. The original concern that the industry had was about isolated drone issues by individuals operating drones in the vicinity of the airport. And we've seen some cases of that, although we've also seen some cases of drones being reported where there's no evidence of the drone being there. I think what's been more evident in Europe of late is a organised attack to disrupt the commercial activity in certain countries. Now, I don't know who's behind that. We can all speculate as to who's behind that, but certainly the degree to which these issues have come about point to a more coordinated, organised, disruptive objective rather than individual people playing with their drum near an airport. Therefore, yes, it is of concern to the industry, and clearly the industry looks to governments to come up with a solution to that. We'll keep this under review, but the trend of late, particularly in the regions in which it's happened, is something that is of concern to us.
We'll take a question at the back of the room. Yeah, on the left first, and then.
Hi, and this is Vinod from Oman. I want to know about we had a AGM in Delhi in June, and 1 week later we had the Air India plane crash in Ahmedabad. It's almost 6 months now. What is the status? We still don't know what actually happened with that incident. What was the cause behind? Why is there so much delay about this? And now that they have also relaunched the survey for the search for MH370. So just some clarifications from them.
So in relation to the Air India accident, I think we do have to commend the Indian government for producing the interim report on time, which provided an initial assessment based on the facts that were available at that stage. But I think it's absolutely critical that all of us wait for the full investigation to be complete. It's normal that under ICAO Annex that the requirement is to publish, if available, if possible, a full report within 12 months. So there's still time for the investigators to complete what clearly is a difficult task to complete their evaluation and to produce their full report. So we won't speculate on what the cause is. We'll wait for the full accident report to be produced. But it does highlight once again how important it is for governments to comply with their obligations under ICAO and produce an interim report within 1 month, 30 days, and then a full report, if possible, within 1 year. We'll wait for that, and I'm sure people will welcome the fact that the search for the Malaysia aircraft has restarted again. It clearly would be of benefit to everybody if we could find greater clarity around that and to be able to complete the investigation into the disappearance of that aircraft. But I don't have any information. I'm not going to speculate. I'll wait for the investigations to conclude and the reports to be published.
Hi, Brian Fenner from CNC3 Television. 2 quick questions. The press release mentions conflicts continuing to hamper airlines with significant costs. Is there a monetary figure attached to that? The second question is, you spoke about political use of airspace and it being inappropriate. We've seen the American president declare online that Venezuelan airspace is closed. There's a notum that has caused several airlines to stop service. So your thoughts on that and the future of airlines operating in the region, both from a safety perspective and a traffic perspective?
Yeah, my comment applies everywhere in the world in relation to airspace. We don't like to see airspace being used for political reasons. And airlines will undertake an assessment where there is a risk to safety and security, and it will be an individual airline decision. So, there are proper channels to be used to announce the closure of airspace. We would encourage all governments to follow those procedures. And even where airspace is declared to be open and available, it's still the responsibility of the individual airline to conduct a risk assessment and satisfy themselves that it's safe for them to continue to operate. And just because one airline operates and has decided that it's safe to do so, does not mean that other airlines will operate, and it doesn't mean that the airline that's operating has made the wrong decision, because the circumstances are different for every airline. And that's why you've got multiple stages in risk evaluation, right down to the responsibility of the commander, the pilot in command, to make a decision before the flight as to whether they can satisfy themselves that the flight can be conducted in a safe manner. So, you know, the risk assessment that airlines undertake is very detailed, and each individual airline will conduct their own risk assessment to satisfy themselves that it's safe to operate. And we believe that that's the right thing to do, and we would encourage governments to conduct their activities in accordance with their obligations under the ICAO procedures and the various agreements that have been reached around access to airspace.
Good morning, Kate Duffy from Bloomberg News. You said about Airbus and just the fact that it was no great surprise that they've revised down their delivery target. Why do you think this is? Are they potentially cutting corners? Are they making their delivery target too high, or is it just a case of bad luck?
No, I don't think they're cutting corners. I would never accuse any of the OEMs of doing that. I think they've just encountered issues that were unanticipated, and that's caused them to have to reevaluate their ability to deliver. We always see a rush of deliveries in the final month of the year, given that it's also their financial year. So that's nothing surprising there. But I think there often is a disconnect between the ability of the airframe OEM to produce the airframe and the engine OEM to produce the engine at the same time as the airframe is available. And we have seen cases where a lot of airframes have been built, but they're waiting for engine supply. So we recognise it's a complex issue, but I don't have any concerns about Airbus cutting corners or anything like that. I think it's just the ambition that they expressed was probably beyond what was possible, and nothing strange in that. I don't think they've met their delivery forecast for a couple of years now. But that's why I say it's no surprise to me that they're not likely to meet the forecast that they had set for themselves.
Good question here.
Ronnie Silk with Travel Weekly US. On seats, I remember at the AGM, Campbell Wilson commenting that was the biggest problem Air India was having was getting seats. I know that's a broader problem. Can you talk to the significance of delays in seats and where that stacks up in terms of, is it one of the worst choke points?
Yeah, it's a great point. It is surprisingly a big choke point at the moment, and we're working collaboratively with the regulators, both the FAA and IATA, and there's a meeting next week, I think. Stuart, is it? Stuart?
Yes, indeed, there's a meeting next week which we welcome to get the regulators around the table and the OEMs, etc., to determine what is the root cause of these certification delays. It's unacceptable that the customers need to wait for the seats to be certified in their aircraft. It's crazy.
Yeah, seat certification is a very complex area and has become more complex. Like it was always an area that went back to my times at BA when we were frustrated by the difficulties and the delays in getting certification for seats. Clearly, it has to be done properly, but we are concerned that it's becoming much more difficult for us to get the industry to get seats certified so that they can enter into service. And it's a surprising choke point that's clear in the industry. It's been there for some time, but it's become even worse. So you're right to highlight it, and I think the fact that there's now a meeting with both of the regulators, the FAA and IATA, with the industry to look at this gives you an indication of the level of frustration that exists in relation to the issue.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We have about 9 minutes left before the embargo breaks and this session ends. So we'll try and get as many questions as we can in. If you can keep your questions short, that'll help us get around to more people. So maybe we'll take one here.
Rick Adams, Aviation Voices. How do you see the impact of artificial intelligence on airline operations, and what concerns do you have?
Great question, and to be honest, I don't think it's a question that anybody can answer at this stage other than to say that there's clear opportunities and probably some threats as well. So AI is being evaluated in every aspect of airline operations where airlines believe that there's an opportunity for them to use it in a more to improve the efficiency of their operation, which we believe is possible. Stuart mentioned using it in terms of maintenance reliability, which we have been using for some time, but clearly advances in technology will make that even better. For revenue management, you think of any aspect of an airline operation, we believe that AI will have an impact. Now, whether this will be net positive or net negative, I think is still an issue that's under debate. Personally, I believe it's going to be a net positive for the industry. But like every industry, I think we're still working to understand exactly where the opportunities are to move quickly to take advantage of those opportunities, while at the same time making sure that we're not opening the industry to any risks from an AI point of view. And some airlines are more advanced than others. Some issues are being evaluated at an industry level. Some individual airlines are looking at this as a competitive advantage issue. I think it's going to become much more clear as we go through 2026, just where AI is going to have an impact on the industry. But I'm personally positive about how AI will be utilized to improve the customer experience, to improve operational efficiency, to improve our interaction with airports and ANSPs, and make it a more efficient airline industry for everyone involved.
Take a question on the far side.
I'm Leman Hamoui from Arab News in Saudi Arabia. My question is specifically about the Middle East's role, as you said, the quote champion of net profit. I want to ask you quickly what factors play a role in that. And would you suggest, or would you say that Saudi Arabia and UAE's roles, how do they contribute to this net profit in the Middle East?
So again, we don't break it down at an individual country level, but the Middle East, what you see is clearly a much stronger focus on long-haul travel, strong premium demand, very good infrastructure availability, clear coordination between airports, suppliers and regulators, all working together to ensure the effective operation of the industry. I think it's a great model for other areas of the world to look at. Pleased to see the GCC look at a common safety regulator, where obviously working together can enhance the overall benefit and security of operations. So I think it's a great example of where everybody is working in the same direction. You've got alignment between all of the key players, and that helps to ensure that the operation of the industry there is as efficient as possible. So very encouraged by what we see in the Middle East, the investments that are being made by the airlines, the airports, ANSP, everything that goes on there, I think is a good example for the regions to follow.
Big question here.
Yes, Eduardo Jimenez Mazón from Aviation Line, Argentina. How would you describe the current relationship between the industry and its unions and workers? And this is kind of answered before, but what impact do you think the advancement of artificial intelligence and automation will have on them?
Yeah, I think the industry relationship is generally positive. I'm not aware of any major issues. There will always be individual items of concern, but at an industry level, I think it's quite good. I think the fact that in Mari's presentation she demonstrates that labour costs are now the #1 cost facing the industry. We continue to be an industry that I think is attractive for labour. I think AI, again, going to what I said, I think there will be opportunities and potential threats everywhere. what I've seen in the past is where technology has been feared. You know, I look at things like self-service technology, which was something that many labour groups feared would have a big impact. That's not the case in anything. I think it's been used to enhance the skills of the people working in airports, because they're now genuinely used for customer service rather than for routine transactional activities that didn't really require a person. I often contrast my experience of checking in to a hotel compared to my experience of traveling with an airline. I'm still incredibly frustrated by the requirement for me to go up to the airline or the hotel desk, to check in and go through the same process, even though I'm traveling, often utilizing the same hotel in many cases, the same hotel chain, more often than not. And yet, it's as if I've just appeared for the first time ever. And I compare that to how the airline industry has adapted self-service technology to benefit the consumer. So I think this is an area where there will be change. But if my experience of the past is any indication of what's likely to happen in the future, I think that there's a real opportunity for this to be beneficial for both the airline, the customer, for all the stakeholders, the airline, the customer, and the employees.
Good question here.
Hi, Helen Massey-Beresford from Aviation Week. I just wanted to come back to SAF. When you talked about the compliance fees, is there any scope for something to be done? Can authorities sort of rectify that problem? And just on the mandates, to be clear, you think the 2030 EU mandates need to be re-evaluated, is that right? And if so, how would that process start?
Yeah, well, you'll have to challenge the EU on that. But is there anything the regulators can do? Absolutely, regulators have complete control and power over this. And that's why we're highlighting this issue as to what is actually happening as a result of these mandates. I don't think regulators anticipated that they would see fuel suppliers utilize the mandate to increase prices. I'd be amazed if that's what they thought would happen. The Economist could have told them that that's what's going to happen, but I don't believe that was obvious to them. I still believe, the EASA report says that the 2030 target is still achievable. I think it's a report that is biased to the optimism and requires everything to go in the right way for the target to be achieved. Personally, I don't believe it is achievable, and I particularly don't believe the ESAF element is either achievable, but also a challenge whether it's responsible. Given that we don't have an excess of renewable electricity, is it the right thing to do to be utilising what limited renewable electricity is available to produce ESAF when there are alternatives available? So I think the regulators can do something, yes. And what should the regulators do? I think they urgently need to look at what is actually happening versus what they believe would happen.
Thank you. I make it at 10:30. That's when we're scheduled to end this.